Well, hi there. So this is our first video of Unit 9, which is about stabilization policies. And we've learned about stabilization policies already in this class. What we're talking about here are fiscal and monetary policies. But we're going to really get into in this unit is like, what's the long run implications of using them? Like what are maybe some additional considerations that we should have as policymakers when we're trying to say, okay, the business cycle is going up and down, we want to smooth that out. What else do we need to be aware of before we just dive in and start monkeying around with it? So the very first lesson here is really kind of a review a little bit, like recall from Unit 8, recall from Unit 7. But then we're going to extend it and talk about maybe some questions and some considerations, right? So the first thing is issues with using fiscal policy, and then we're going to switch to using monetary policy. And this is just remember that one of the issues is lag time, right? It takes time to recognize the problem. It takes time to develop a solution. It takes time to implement the solution. Those are the three significant lags. There's the risk of politically motivated policies, and the idea that you might have a politician who wants to increase the government spending because they're trying to ensure aggregate demand is higher and they want everybody to get jobs, and then they get reelected. That may not always be a good thing. Then these other ones are, if we remember, these are why AD might not increase as much as we think, right? And we actually learned these two already. One of them is called crowding out. One of them is called net export effect. And essentially, this is kind of a review, this higher interest rates, of something we learned in Unit 8 as well, right? This we talked about in 8.4, lesson 2, actually. So in lecture 8.4, lesson 2, we talked about how if there's more government borrowing, it can reduce investment spending because the borrowing by the government crowds out the private domestic investment. We also know that this other factor of like why aggregate demand might not go up would be because if you have lots of government spending and tax cuts and consumption spending is going up from those, it's going to make our prices higher, and that makes our goods and services less competitive in the international market. So it reduces our exports a little bit. So these are why aggregate demand might not go up as much as we would think. Now, there's a second kind of related idea, and this is kind of some new stuff, right? The first question that sometimes get asked is like, should we have these persistently large deficits every year? And this requires you to know what a deficit is. The deficit is the annual gap between government revenue and spending. So this is what we call the annual gap, right? Because government is not like a business. Oftentimes, folks from all sides of the political spectrum might say government's like a business, right? Or it's like a household and all of that. It's really not. Governments are different from households and firms in the sense that their borrowing activities don't really work the same way that households and firms do. That's kind of an elision of some important distinctions when people say that governments should operate like businesses or like households. But that doesn't mean, though, that government should have persistently large deficits every year. The answer is probably not, right? Especially during really good economic times, that the government should try to stabilize the economy. Now, that's code for, in really good economic times, they should raise taxes and they should cut back their own spending. But governments don't usually do that because governments, especially like the United States, in theory, represent the will of the people. And it's hard to convince people like, yeah, I'm going to raise your taxes because we're in a good economic expansion and we want to smooth the business cycle. So that's hard to do. The reason for the probably not is that it can crowd out private investment, right? What we just talked about. And there's a high opportunity cost of paying interest on the debt. The US debt annually, right? And I want you to kind of guess what our annual interest payments are on the US debt. And the US debt, by the way, stands at about $25 trillion. Annual interest payments are about $400 billion with a B. That's a lot of money. And it's a lot of money in the sense that we're foregoing doing other stuff with it. So one of the considerations about deficits is we probably don't want to run them that much when we're in good economic times. There's not a good reason to do it because it crowds out these other priorities. Now, the question then becomes like, when is the debt or the deficit too large? And it's very important to recognize that like most economists wouldn't say that a raw number matters. Now, there are certain political lobbying groups and things like that that will basically use headline grabbing numbers. They'll say $25 trillion, $30 trillion. They'll have these very large numbers, and it is a big number. But what economists would say the better thing to do would be to compare that number to the size of the economy, because what it really represents is like the capacity of the economy. And when we make that comparison, we're saying the government has the ability to tax the economy and pay for some of these things like the debt. And so we kind of compare the size of the economy to the size of the debt. If you have a very small economy and an enormous debt, then that's very different from a huge economy and an enormous debt, right? You know, you have kind of different levels of ability to pay. So the common rule has historically been 100% of your debt to GDP. That's the ratio. So like if you have $1 billion size economy, you probably shouldn't have more than $1 billion in debt. If you have a $20 trillion economy, you probably shouldn't have more than $20 trillion in debt. And likewise, there's a 3% deficit to GDP ratio that, and these numbers, just so you know, they don't have like a really strongly quantitative basis. They're just kind of round numbers that economists are like, that's probably a good level, where after that level, if we exceed that, we want to start to maybe question what we're doing, right? And just so you know, right, and thinking about how big is the debt in this sense, I'll show you here. Move my face out of the way a little bit. Move your face, Daniel. This is the total public debt as the percent of GDP. And you can see that for most of kind of the American last 50 years, we've been well under that 100%. In the 2008 financial crisis, the size of the economy shrank. So the GDP shrank and the borrowing went up. And so we actually got right up to about 100% by 2012. We bounced around that, slowly increasing. But then with our pandemic, we are up above 125%. Now, some of you might, watching this, go, oh my gosh, right? The sky is falling. But what we also have to think about is comparing us to the other folks who lenders might be considering, right? And so people who are considering lending to a government, they look at it and they go, should I lend to the US government? Should I lend to France? Should I lend to Canada? Should I lend to Japan? And all of those other countries experienced the same thing at the same time. So every single country on earth was like doing its thing and then spiked in their percent of public debt as a percent of GDP. Again, because GDP shrinks during recessions and spending goes up. So this is not surprising. And what I wouldn't want you to take away from this is saying like the sky is falling because we exceeded the 100%, because everybody else pretty much did too, right? Everybody else had that same increase. So that's kind of something to think about. This is the deficit to GDP ratio, and it goes way farther back. You can see World War II, the deficit was an enormous percentage of our total GDP in that sense, like the ratio of the two. You can see that for a brief period in the late 1990s, we actually had a surplus. That's when it's a positive number here. And then 2007, we had the deficit increasing again because and GDP basically getting smaller. So we had this very large kind of gap, right? A 10% gap was quite big. And it went right back to kind of about 2.5%, 3%, right? Then there were some tax cuts that got passed in 2015. And you can see that our deficit got bigger, down to about 4.5%. And I can remember actually 2 or 3 years ago when I was teaching this class in 2018, 2019, that one of the things I said was, we have this 3% guideline so that we know maybe we shouldn't be cutting taxes in the middle of an economic expansion. And the explanation for that is you never know when a rainy day is going to happen. And a rainy day absolutely happened. And you can see there 15% is the ratio now of deficit to GDP. That doesn't necessarily mean, right, that like alarm bells should be ringing in your head. What it means is maybe we should be thinking about, when the next economic expansion happens, maybe we should be thinking about raising taxes and cutting government spending, like that we should start taking this more seriously. So that's kind of a bit of a digression about that, but it is useful, I think, to consider those things. Monetary policy also has issues. Remember from Unit 8, we talked about the risk of the temptation to monetize the debt, to just print money to pay the debt. We know that the reserve requirement and the discount rate are less effective for various reasons. We worry about, if we get too reliant on using monetary policy, we worry about people getting comfortable with really high inflation, and that can create the comfort for hyperinflation, right? It's the idea of you put a frog in a boiling pot of water. If you put them in and it's boiling, they'll jump right out. But if you slowly raise the temperature, you could boil that frog. And that's that worry about people getting used to higher and higher levels of inflation. And the last thing that we have to think about with monetary policy is the risk that fiscal policymakers like the president and Congress will pressure central banks to, like the Fed, to do things that maybe aren't really in the interest of the American economy. And we can see that, right? That happened in the last few years with Janet Yellen getting a lot of pressure as the leader of the central bank to loosen monetary policy. And she said, it's really not the right time to do that, right? We're in an expansion. Why should we be making the interest rates even lower? Now, the other thing about monetary policy is something we learned last unit as well. This was in lecture 8.4, number 2. And it's the idea that we observe that the amount of output, right, full employment capacity, YF, is not really related to price levels. We know that, LRAS is a vertical line. We also can notice that money supply is not related to output or interest rates, because those two variables, right, output and interest rates, will actually rubber band back to where they used to be after you've changed the money supply. So this is how that happens, right? So we'd say, therefore, output goes back down again. It's kind of the last piece there. So if you increase the money supply and you push down on that rubber band of the interest rate, the consumption and investment will rise, the aggregate demand will rise, but price levels and inflationary expectations will rise as well, right? We expect that to happen. When you push aggregate demand up, prices should rise in the economy. When that occurs, SRAS will decrease because of higher wages and higher input costs and things like that. And so output falls right back to where it used to be. So the money supply in the long run cannot really affect the amount of output. We just rubber band back. The other thing is, when those price levels are rising, it makes people's demand for money go up, because people are like, I gotta need more money in order to do my transactions, right? Transaction demand. And when demand for money goes up, the interest rate on money goes up, because that's the price of money. So the interest rate will go right back to where it started as well. You can see that it circles right back. So we can say that in the long run, thus, the changes in the money supply don't really affect output. They don't really affect interest rates, but they do affect prices, right? The prices can go up. And that's the risk, is that if we just continually rely on it to try to use it as our only tool in the toolbox, it can make our prices higher. There's the one exception to it that we learned about in Unit 7, and it's the idea that if you can really get the interest rate to change investment spending, then that can affect capital goods, right? Machinery, factories, buildings, which affects our productive capacity. This is why F or LRAS, right? And it's saying that's going to go up. That's long-run growth. Right? Long-run growth. Now, that is literally at odds with the story I just told you. Right? There's one story that's like, nah, you can't affect it. One story that says, yeah, you can do it, maybe. The evidence is kind of mixed for this one down here at the bottom. Right? In theory, it's possible, but it's maybe less true in certain circumstances. We could talk about that in class if you have questions about it. On an AP test and on a Glossinger test, you got to know both, because the questions are going to guide you toward one of those being the right answer. And you just kind of follow the direction of the question, follow the breadcrumbs is my advice. All right, so hopefully this helped you kind of summarizing some of these issues. I'll see you next time.